Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dravidian Does Audio History. My name is Arjun, and today I thought we'd talk a little bit about the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, for those of you who don't know, is one of those seminal pieces of world literature that for some reason still does not get the airtime that other seminal pieces of world literature do. It is in the same league as the Odyssey, or the Iliad, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Bible. But curiously enough, this Indian epic does not get the same amount of attention that these other epics tend to get, particularly around regions outside the core area of its popularity, meaning the areas that are influenced by Indic culture and has been occupied by Indians throughout history. Now, here comes the first question related to the Mahabharata. What is the Mahabharata? The Mahabharata, as it exists today and is understood by most people, is a classical Sanskrit epic poem that tells the story of fundamentally a war that took place way back in the past of India's legendary and mythological history, sprinkled with actual history. And it showcases the conflicts of human emotions through this conflict of two sides of the same family trying to gain the throne of the kingdom of Kuru and the throne that is set in Hastinapura and Indraprastha. That is a foundational story of the Mahabharata, but it is so much more than that. This poem, written in the classical Sanskrit language, contains about 100,000 shlokas, or about 200,000 lines, meaning that it is roughly 10 times the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, making it one of, if not the largest poetic epic in the world. This is a piece of literature that is at least about 2000 years old, with a much older tradition existing before its written down status coming out during the classical Sanskrit period. The Mahabharata details the story of this conflict of the two sides of the Kuru family and ending in the battle or the war that happens over 18 days in Kurukshetra, which is again an actual real life location that you can find in India, and the many trials and tribulations that the leading faction or the heroic faction of the narrative, the Pandavas, go through is the primary narrative and primary thread of the Mahabharata epic poem. But beyond telling just the story of this conflict within this family, it is also a mirror to the cultural developments, human emotions, psychological, astrological, mythological, emotional, mental, and other such conflicts that existed throughout Indian history up to that point. And it deals with a lot of metaphysical questions, and again, it also deals with a lot of basic human emotions, but filtered through the lens of psychology and metaphysics. And it is thus one of the greatest pieces of literature, quite apart from being one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. Regardless of what form that you come to this poem, be it in its classical Sanskrit form or in the modern language versions available, be it in Hindi, be it in English, be it in Urdu, be it in Malayalam, be it Tamil, be it any other language that you can come to, the story is very pertinent. There are different aspects of the story that you can always relate to and you can always go back to. And there's so much emotional and mental and geographical and psychological and other such aspects of human development and existence woven into the fabric of this poem that everybody is able to find something to connect to and something to relate to within this extraordinarily huge, vast, diverse, and incredible poem. That is why the Mahabharata poem is so important. Beyond the fact that it is a classical piece of literature in the Sanskrit language and other languages in India in particular, Mahabharata as a story is foundational to the history and mythology of the Indian subcontinent and the cultures that have developed in it for the past 2,500 years in particular. The Mahabharata story and its evolution over these 2500 years is closely linked with the evolution of the different societies and kingdoms and dynasties that have evolved within the Indian subcontinent. And again, the story of Delhi itself, the current capital of India, is again closely woven into the fabric of the Mahabharata story itself, because Delhi is considered to be the ancient site of the capital city of the Pandavas, that was Indraprastha. So, from pre monarchical times, that location has been significant for the Indian subcontinent, and eventually it became the imperial capital of the Delhi Sultans, and then under the Mughals, and then under the British, and now the capital of the Republic of India. So, again, going far back, it connects the present history of the Indian subcontinent with its past. And there are several other threads like that that connect the Mahabharata with the present of India to its glorious past. And quite apart from that, discussing the Mahabharata is also quite a controversial and touchy subject, because unlike the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Norse epic poems that discuss Odin and Thor and all of those beings, or the Avesta of Iran. The Mahabharata is a living text. It is a living poetic tradition, because the characters discussed in it are mostly semi gods, but also actual gods that are worshipped in Indian mythology are also existent in this narrative. And the story is believed to be historic, or at least semi historic, by most South Asians. And because the story is told and retold in almost every household in the Indian subcontinent, and the characters who appear in it are worshipped and celebrated and are identified with even today by the common Indian, the discussion of such a seminal and important text can be quite controversial and touchy, because as you all know, Indians, whether they be on internet or in real life, can be quite a volatile group, especially when dealing with mythology and history and religion. So that's why discussing the Mahabharata may be touchy, but it's also very important that we talk about this grand epic piece of Indian literature. But that doesn't get as much attention that it deserves in the conversation of the great pieces of literature of the world, as well as one of the foundational stones of human civilization itself. Now, let us talk about what the Mahabharata is in the context of a mythological and religious textual tradition. The main characters of the Mahabharata narrative are the two factions who are fighting for the throne of Hastinapura and Indraprastha, the two capital cities of the Kuru kingdom, two divided portions that are being fought over. The two factions are the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The Pandavas being a set of five brothers, and the Kauravas being a set of about 100 brothers, who are both supposedly descendants of the same dynasty, and then they are again linked back to earlier traditions and earlier heroes, and their genealogy is provided within the text itself, and it connects back to an ancient imagined history of India, and a history of India where within uh, the geographical precincts of what is present day Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, and all those regions. That is where the story is primarily set. The Kauravas and the Pandavas are cousins, are related to each other by blood, and they grow up together but grow up as rivals for the throne, and eventually their hatred for each other leads to this great conflict that lasts for 18 days, and both sides use all kinds of tricks, rightful and unrightful, lawful and unlawful, righteous and unrighteous, to try and beat each other. And at the end of it, it's a Pyrrhic victory for the Pandava side, who lose most of their sons. They both lose a huge faction of their relatives. The entire Bharatavarsha, or the entire descendants and lineages of Bharata, who is the ancestor of all these tribes and all these kingdoms, is decimated. And even though the Pandavas win, it's double-edged sword, because again it creates such chaos and so causes so much damage and heartache and losses in life and limb and resources for this, that again that complication is described within this poem of why warfare can be so cruel for people and communities and societies. So all of this is contained within the narrative of the Mahabharata itself. And apart from the narrative of the two rival factions, we are also introduced to a whole host of characters, including the god Krishna, who acts in his human form to assist the Pandavas in their battle against the Kauravas, because the Kauravas are again depicted as the evil side, trying to um, pull a fast one over the Pandavas and trying to gather all the resources and all the power in the Kuru kingdom by ousting their cousins. And we meet a whole bunch of other characters, most significant among them being Draupadi or Panjali, who is the wife of all five of the Pandavas, who is a dark-skinned lady who in this period holds significant amount of power and is the embodiment of righteousness but also vengeance, because again violence against her perpetrated by the Kauravas is again a significant catalyst towards the escalation of the rivalry between the two factions leading to the war. So again, this is a very fundamentally Indian story, but that can also be related back to fundamental human emotions that are pertinent to every person and every society and every culture in the world. There are so many characters, so many incidents that happen, small and big, and connected and not connected. There's the narrative is so huge and so vibrant and so varied that any reader or listener or watcher or viewer can take something out of the story to relate to their lives and their emotions and to their background. That is why the Mahabharata story is so important and is so significant and so influential, particularly in South Asia, but also in academic circles for people who have taken the opportunity and the time to research and find more about this story from beyond just, other great epics of the world like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now the question comes, when and how was the Mahabharata created? Because again, it is a piece of written literature. And when did it come to be? That is again a controversial question because academics, be they archaeologists and linguists and Indologists, have different opinions about the creation of the Mahabharata poem. The poem itself internally tells us a story about the creation of the poem. Within the poem, it is stated that the Mahabharata poem itself, of the 100,000 shlokas or couplets, was based off of an earlier poem called the Bharata, which contained about 24,000 verses, which again itself was based on an earlier poem called the Jaya, which contained about 8,000 verses. This is very reasonable and a rational way of looking at the evolution of poetry and stories in any period of time. Imagine you telling one of your friends a little incident from your past or from your neighborhood, and as the story continues down the line among the different people, it grows little by little, and a small incident that might have involved two people might grow into a huge kerfuffle between two sides of the same family. Similarly, it is generally agreed that the Mahabharata story was based on incidents that took place in the Indian subcontinent, possibly in the prehistoric, pre dynastic period, where two sides of the same family fought over a certain piece of land, and then over the centuries and over the millennia, the story grew in the telling as bards carried the story over the land and entertained people and told each other in song and in verse. The story grew from a simple story, a simple poem of about 8,000 verses, into the behemoth that is the Mahabharata of classical Sanskrit of the 100,000 verses. Now, trying to date the period of the poem has proved extremely controversial. Different people, different schools of thought, different academicians approach it differently. There's a school of Indologists and Indian academics and non academics who try to position the dating of the Mahabharata period, particularly the Kurukshetra war, based on textual evidence within the final text that is available to us. And they also use astronomical references provided within the text as well, and try to date the war of Kurukshetra. And the estimates vary from 4000 BCE to 40,000 BCE to 12,000 BCE. Different estimates come, but the most popular version for this uh, faction is roughly around 4000 BCE, which again seems extremely unlikely for the other side of the argument, who base their understanding of the placement of the Kurukshetra war based on not just the textual evidence but also extra textual evidence like archaeology and numismatics and archaeobiology and digging up actual historical sites and such, and doing carbon dating and such, who believe that the Mahabharata episode and the Kurukshetra war could not have taken place any earlier than 1000 BCE, which again finds a lot more proponents within the academic and archaeological and linguistics field. The more scientific of the fields of human study generally tends to agree that the Mahabharata period and the Kurukshetra war could not have taken place earlier than 1000 BCE. There are several reasons why that period has been concluded as the most likely period for the occurrence of the Mahabharata war. The final form of this text that is available in classical Sanskrit is only dated to roughly 400 CE or slightly earlier than that. That is because the polities, the states discussed in it, are contemporaneous to that period, including the Romans and the Scythians and those societies, which could not have existed and been mentioned in a text that was written at 4000 BCE, or even 2000 BCE, or even 1000 BCE. So the text itself provides us some references to the period in which it was written down. There is also the evidence of the language itself. The language used in the classical Sanskrit version of the Mahabharata is the classical Sanskrit of Panini, and it was popularized during the Gupta Empire period. And it's highly likely that the final version of the poem, with its 100,000 slokas, was finally written down during the Gupta period or slightly earlier, roughly from about 200 BCE to 200 CE. In that period, it got written down in its classical form. But earlier versions of the poem do exist. We don't have entire documents of it, but we do have references to it, and we do have some portions of it available, and which shows a language that is slightly more archaic than the classical Sanskrit, which means that the tradition had already existed before the final form was put down in classical Sanskrit. But even then, the version that is available to us in these archaic forms are of a later version of the language that is used in the Rigvedic text as well as the Upanishads. So again, the Rig Veda and the Upanishads themselves are separated by about 500 years. So the text again can't have been written before 500 BCE based on the evidence provided in the text itself, because the Mahabharata text itself is not familiar with such fundamental historical figures and movements in India, like the Mahajanapadas and the Buddhist and Jainist movements and the Maurya hegemony over most of India. So that gives us a placement of the date of the text to roughly around 200 BCE to 200 CE as being the most likely period when the final version of the epic poem was put down. But that does not mean that is the period in which the actual Kurukshetra war or the Kuru kingdom existed, because archaeological evidence and numismatic evidence and other such scientific evidence provides us with what is called the painted grayware culture, which is a culture that existed all over most of North India from roughly around 1200 BCE to about 500 BCE. And in that period, the painted grayware culture kind of identifies itself as being connected to the Mahabharata story, because a lot of the sites that are mentioned in the Mahabharata have been investigated by academics like Dr. B.B. Lal, who have investigated these sites mentioned, including Indraprastha, which is in Delhi, and Hastinapura. And investigations in these locations have consistently found evidence of painted grayware culture, potsherds, and other such minor archaeological instruments and evidences that support the likelihood that a unified, uniform culture existed throughout what is northern India and the locations that are mentioned in the Mahabharata in the period of from roughly 1000 BCE to 500 BC in particular. But dating of the Kuru kingdom based on inscriptional evidence as well as later genealogies and archaeological evidence puts the date of the Kuru kingdom that is mentioned in the Mahabharata text to roughly around 1000 to 800 BCE. And it is in that period that the Kurukshetra battle might have taken place, that being the most reasonable period of time in which it could have taken place. The battle was not between huge kingdoms as described in the Mahabharata text that is available to us, because in the period of time that archaeological evidence supports the existence of this battle and the sites that are associated with the Mahabharata, the societies that existed in India were not monarchic in the traditional sense. There were still early tribal chieftainships where the Indo-Aryan language speakers had established themselves over all of North India and had started setting up small principalities. And they were heavily ritualized Vedic communities who followed the Vedic gods, including Agni and Varuna and all of these ancestral gods of the Indo-Aryan language-speaking peoples mentioned in the Vedic corpus. And this culture was a heavily tribal, nomadic, pastoralist culture. They were just starting to settle down as agriculturalists. So they were not extraordinary kingdoms like the Mesopotamians or ancient Egypt. And there was nothing of that stature in India at this time, and at least until for another few hundred years. So these small kingdoms, they still had some historical evidence that connect us to that period and gives us some historical characters like Janamejaya and Parikshit, who are mentioned in the later half and the later portions of the Mahabharata text, giving us some clues as to the actual historical period that the story is set in. The Mahabharata war, thus, based on a collection of different clues, be it numismatic, archaeological, biological, and other such non textual as well as textual and linguistic evidences, places the battle to have taken place roughly around 1000 to 800 BCE in what would have been known as the Kuru kingdom in northern India, pertaining to what is today Haryana and Delhi in particular, with Indraprastha having existed in the earliest layers of the city that is now Delhi, particularly Old Delhi. So it is understood now by academics in general that two sides of the same family fought for the throne of this kingdom, and the side that won aligned with the Brahminical order and used the Shrauta rituals, heavily ritualized Brahminical processions and celebrations and rituals and sacrifices to legitimize themselves and to elevate themselves and then tell the stories of the dynasty and legitimize it and popularize it among the community. And as the bards told this story over and over again, performing it in front of audiences, both royal as well as ordinary, the story grew in the telling. People became familiar with the story and they told each other these stories. And different versions of the story grew up in different regions of northern India and then slowly spread to the rest of the country. And by the time of the Guptas, this story had established itself as authoritarian, authorial, and with intent, and had found itself into the fabric of the society that had established itself in India. And the story had established its stature as a great epic story. And it grew and it became the Mahabharata that we are all familiar with today. But again, different versions of the story exist in different parts of the country. There are minor differences, there are some major differences, which is also true for the Ramayana as well, which we might discuss in another episode entirely, because that is also a fascinating story. But over several centuries, the simple story of two sides of the same family fighting for a small tribal, pastoral, nomadic chieftainship grew into the story of a huge epical war between good and evil, and the extremely complex situation created by familial rivalries and internecine struggles, representing monarchic evolution and cultural evolutions that had happened in India by that time. And the story got transplanted from its original tribal settings to the wealthy kingdoms that people were familiar with during the Gupta period and the preceding centuries as well. And that's how the story grew in the telling. And anybody who's heard any story grow in the telling would understand this concept of the story growing in the telling. Different people throughout ages have had different interpretations of the story. Different aspects of the Mahabharata story have interested people in different ways. There are feminist studies of the poem which discusses the role of the main female characters in the story, including the royal mothers Kunti and the female heroine who is Draupadi and Panchali, or Draupadi or Panchali, to be honest, and the other female figures who are depicted and the way they are depicted and way they are treated within the story. There are interpretations of the whole Brahminical system. There are interpretations of kingship, how it was performed within this context, the linguistic evolution of how kingship evolved over several hundred years, and how that was managed within the story. And again, the more we study the story, more facets of Indian history and mythology and social consciousness can be gleaned from the story of the Mahabharata. I myself have my own pet theories regarding the story, some of which might be extremely controversial if I state them out loud. But again, that is the fun, that is the significance of the poem, is that people can always delve into it and find something interesting about it. Even though this is a story set thousands of years ago, even though it was written at least 2000 years ago, it still speaks of fundamental human emotions and conflicts that are within and without that we can see every day in everybody's lives. Now, I'll go forward and discuss one of my pet theories, which might get me into trouble, but that is the whole point of discussing history and literature and mythology and religion. It is to discuss and find ideas and find new avenues and to find something interesting to talk about and maybe establishing new perspectives that somebody might not have interpreted before, or maybe elaborating on existing theories and then finding new ways to prove them or disprove them. That is a challenge that I set to myself every time I discuss history, which I also want people who are listening to this to also undertake, to challenge yourself, to challenge the existing narratives and challenge existing ideas and find new ways at looking at stories. So I'll give you my pet theory and then you can rip me to shreds once you listen to it. So within the poem, we are given a fundamental framework that the Pandavas are the heroes and the Kauravas are the villains, and the Kauravas keep the Pandavas away from their rightful throne, and then eventually the right wins, and the righteous group, the Pandavas, win out over the unrighteous Kauravas, and order is established in the world. But that is the version that is found in the classical version of the text and the most popular version of the text. But different other versions of the texts provide, and even the earlier versions of the text provide us with different versions of the same story. And the answers are not so simple and straightforward. Now, look at it this way. Within the story itself, the legitimacy and the claim of both sides are contested. So I'll give you a primer on why there is a contest between the Kauravas and the Pandavas if the line of succession was established. So the Kaurava Kuru kingdom line, I'll discuss it as Kuru kingdom. We'll look at it rationally like that. The Kuru kingdom, it came down to two princes on who should take over the throne of the Kuru kingdom. On one side was Dhritarashtra, who was the eldest, and so should have been the rightful heir to the throne, but he was blind. So in this system, the blind person could not be king. On the other side was Pandu, his younger brother, who um, was named Pandu because his skin was full of maledictions and he had some kind of skin disease. So both of them were afflicted, but because Dhritarashtra was blind, he was deemed unfit to succeed to the throne, even though he was elder, and the kingdom went to Pandu. Now, Pandu had two wives, Madri and Kunti. But Pandu was cursed by a sage who he had interrupted, and he was cursed that he would never be able to have coitus with his wives under the penalty of death. So if he tried to sleep with his wives, he'd die. So then the lion can't succeed. So he had to be a hermit. Too sad. So, but what happened was Pandu could not keep his thingamajiggy to himself and scoodly pooped with his wife Madri, and then he died. Too sad. So then Kunti and Madri are in a bit of a conundrum because they need heirs for the throne. So what happens is that Kunti, who was once blessed by the gods for her good deeds, that if she ever wanted to have children, she can invoke the names of the gods by saying a special spell, and then the gods would bestow her with a child. So she, as a teenager before she got married, tested the spell out and gave birth to a child called Karna, who she washed away like Moses in a river, who was later adopted by other people and would come back into the story later. But then, because she had already tested the theory, she told Madri, hey, since we can't have children with our husband, our dead husband now, let's have children with the gods. So they used the spell that Kunti was given, and they end up having five children, five boys from a set of five gods. So these five boys are the Pandavas. On the other side of the family, Dhritarashtra was married to a lady named Gandhari, and Gandhari was so devoted to him that she did not want to see the world that her husband could not see. So she tied a blindfold around her eye and accompanied her husband in blindness. So, because Pandu died, Dhritarashtra then inherited the throne and became the king of the Kuru kingdom. And then again, he was having trouble having children, but eventually Kunti gave birth to a huge mass of flesh or a mamsapinda. And she cut these into small little pieces and put them in little earthen vessels, and they gave birth eventually to the Kauravas, or the 100 or so sons and a daughter that she had. So again, these Kauravas were born out of her body. She gave birth to the piece of meat that she chopped up to make the test tube babies, as people seem to take literally today. And again, this piece of meat that she gave birth to was biologically the child of her and Dhritarashtra. So now here comes the rationalization within the story. Who then gets the throne? Is it the children of the elder prince, who was Dhritarashtra, who was denied the throne but then given the throne? Or does the throne directly go to the sons of Pandu, who was given the throne but then died so Dhritarashtra could get the throne? So who gets the throne? Who is legitimately the heir to the throne? That is a foundational question that leads to the rivalry between the two factions in the oldest and actual available versions of the story. But again, as they grow up, the Pandavas are highlighted to be righteous people. They are shown to be good people, while the Kauravas are shown to be not so great people. The Kauravas try to kill the Pandavas on several occasions. And then in the story itself, at several occasions, it is shown that the Kauravas try to cheat the Pandavas out of their rightful inheritance. They cheat them in dice games. They give them the worst part of the kingdom to build a small kingdom there, and that's how Indraprastha is created, by destroying the Gandheva forest. I think that's what it's called, or that might be the name of the bow of Arjuna, the one of the heroes of the story. I forget the name of the actual forest. I think Gandhiva is the bow. Anyway, they had to destroy a whole forest to establish Indraprastha, and then there's rivalry between them, and then eventually the two sides decide that there's no other way but to end up fighting each other in a war to get hold of the throne. That is the story. And in the end, both sides play unfairly. They both cheat each other during the actual war. Both sides play dirty. There are lots of violations of rules of war and chivalry. And in the end, the Pandavas win and all the Kauravas die. And that is the story. But if you look at it from purely objective perspective, who actually deserves the throne? Who do the Pandavas really have any claim to the throne? If you look at it from a purely biological and primogeniture succession set of rules, right? So the only people who are rightfully heirs to the throne are the people who are related by bloodline to the throne, right? That is generally understood to be how succession takes place in most kingdoms. The Kauravas are definitely in line to the throne because they are the biological children of Dhritarashtra and Gandhari. Gandhari gave birth to the piece of meat that she then chopped up to give birth to these divine children. In the case of the Pandavas, they are in no way connected to the family that is connected to Pandu and then Dhritarashtra and their line to the Kuru kingdom itself, because the children are only related to Kunti and Madri because the fathers of all these boys are gods. At least that's what the story tells us. Now, as a historian, whenever we are presented with information like this, whether be it in ancient times or whether be it in not so ancient times, we always look at the extra-textual evidence to provide us with information to say why is there a justification, or why is there a need to embellish the story to such an extent to give us a legitimizing reason for the narrative to take place. For example, if we look at the story of Ramses II, the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, he tells us he builds all these great temples, and he's vehement in his attempt to portray himself as this great victor of the Battle of Kadesh against his mortal rivals, and he again and again and again highlights his victory. But in the actual historical record and on the treaty signed by him and his enemies, the war itself is very quite inconclusive. Neither side actually comes out on top. But the way that he's vehemently showing within the confines of the Egyptian empire or the state that he has won this battle and he oppressed his opponents and he won this great victory again and again and again and again and constantly building temples and friezes depicting this is kind of an example of an inferiority complex, showing that he's trying to sanitize this not so great victory that the battle could he almost could have lost, but somehow escaped through. So he's trying to whitewash that legacy. Similarly, if we look at more recent stories, we always see politicians, particularly if you look at the case of the US, where politicians try to whitewash their actions and give us alternative facts, trying to give alternative versions of history and tell us the stories that did not actually occur, but trying to give us, a different idea of what might have been to try and justify what they did and try to whitewash their actual actions, which I think is one of the reasons why the Mahabharata story became popular and why the story is so confusing and convoluted in the way it deals with righteousness and unrighteousness. Because, again, within the framework of the story itself, the Pandavas are not biologically related to the Kuru kingdom. Their father is not Pandu. And then within the story itself, most of the kingdoms that go to war and most of the people related to the Kuru kingdom itself fight against the Pandavas. But again, in the later parts of the story, that is whitewashed away and explained away by saying that, oh, they were bound by, laws of loyalty to the throne and they did not want to side with the other side because then everybody would be overwhelmed and the Kauravas would be destroyed and such. And there are different explanations given to why all of these kingdoms did not align with the apparently righteous and apparently wholly pure Pandavas. And then in the story itself, we see the Pandavas using um, unrighteous means and evil tactics to defeat the Kauravas. So they are not again entirely truthful and righteous in their actions within the story framework itself. So what does that tell us? um, it might be that there was a general understanding that the Pandavas were a usurping line of the actual Kuru kingdom and that they replaced the actual legitimate line, which was of the Kauravas, and then had to use different ceremonies and different festivals and different versions of the performance of this poem to legitimize their claim to the throne and to establish themselves as the righteous rulers of this kingdom, which is a highly likely explanation to the complications of the poem itself, based on later historical trends, as we see in the stories of other kingdoms and other dynasties that come to the throne and try to whitewash their ascendants through the throne. We hear the story of Ashoka Maurya, for example, where there is a period where he's depicted as Chanda Ashoka, where he goes on the rampage and kills all his brothers and siblings to attain the throne. And then his story of attaining enlightenment by becoming Buddhist and eschewing all kinds of warfare is propagated by he himself through his rock and stone edicts and pillar edicts. But again, we know that the reality was quite different because his was a huge empire and he did invade several places, and that the Kalinga War and the first evidence of his conversion to Buddhism are separated by quite a few years. So it was not immediately evident that he repented. So again, we hear how stories are created and propagated to tell a different version of the story and to legitimize a dynasty or a king or a usurping line. So that's what I think might have happened in this earlier period, where a not so legitimate line of the family, who might not have been directly in line to the throne, saw an opportunity, took it, and replaced the legitimate line, and then used all the tools that were available to them, be it Brahminical hegemony, be it the Shrauta rituals, be it the Ashwamedha, and all these other horse sacrifices and festivals and bardic performances and paying singers to go around and tell the story and putting it down as a form of writing, as later would happen with inscriptions and great epic poetry like the story of Prithviraj Chauhan written in the Prithviraj Raso and such. We hear this being repeated again and again of kings trying to change the narrative by patronizing poetry and other such things. So it might have happened. That's what I think is a possibility for the creation of the Mahabharata poem at its earliest stage and how it grew to be what it became. But if you have your own opinions regarding the existence of this poem, do let me know. But all I wanted to do with this episode was to introduce a discussion on Mahabharata as one of the greatest pieces of human ingenuity and creativity, because that's definitely what it is. The Mahabharata has existed in the Indian subcontinent for nigh on 2000 years, and it has grown and influenced people's life every day. Almost every child grown in the Indian subcontinent, be it in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, or Sri Lanka, has heard a version of the Mahabharata story and are familiar with the names of the characters in the story, be it Krishna, be it Draupadi or Panchali, be it Arjuna, Bhima, or the Ashwini twins, or any of the other great characters featured in the story. Everybody knows the Kurukshetra war. If not through the actual poem itself, through different versions of the story available in the local languages, or through the many TV shows and movies that have been adapted and presented on screen to show this great story. So I hope that people outside the Indic sphere learn to appreciate this great piece of work and familiarize themselves with it, either in the form of literature or through TV shows or animated movies or any which way that you can get access to it. There are multiple versions of the Mahabharata in English available for people. There is the Penguin version, there is the version published by an Indian author fairly recently, which is quite exhaustive and entertaining at the same time. There are modern retellings of the story. There's, of course, the modern as well as the 80s version of the TV show Mahabharat, which is available in Hindi, and you can also watch it in other Indian languages as well. So I would recommend that people take some time out of their lives to familiarize yourself with the Mahabharata, because it truly is an engaging story, quite apart from being one of the greatest accomplishments of humanity. If you have been familiarizing yourself with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the story of Moses and Jesus and all of these other fictional characters, maybe you should also familiarize yourself with one of these linchpins or tent poles of South Asian culture, which is still alive and well and thriving all across the Indic sphere of influence. So I hope I have accomplished that by inciting a little curiosity in every person to try and check out the Mahabharata in any form that is available to you. Hopefully, I have accomplished that. That was my mission. And if you have your own pet theories, might be loony like mine, but I would recommend that you think about it. Try to relate it to actual real world history and find nuggets that might entertain you, that might incite your curiosity, that might make you ask more questions of why certain stories are told, why certain stories are told in certain ways. So hopefully we'll hear more of it. If you have any questions, do let me know. Leave comments below. Do not get violent or argumentative, because that is not what the point of any of this is. It's just to discuss history. It's just to discuss mythology and folklore and Indic traditions. This is an open forum so that we can engage in conversations. So I'm hoping we'll have more conversations in the future. Until the next episode comes out, I hope you have fun or hope you enjoy life. I hope you take some time to get familiar with the Mahabharata. Till I see you next time, have a great day. This is Arjun for Dravidian Does Audio History. Have a great day, everyone.